All right, so tonight we're gonna start on First Chronicles. Here, before that, a couple of notes. The first note I have to make. Remember last time I said I was talking about the 10 tribes of Israel that basically disappeared from the face of the earth. I said if you went on some really kooky websites, you find people with weird theories, but that even the History Channel documentaries wouldn't have that kind of stuff in it. I spoke too soon, because yesterday I was watching a History Channel documentary in which the guy hosting it pointed out that Gad was one of the 10 tribes that, of course, was deported by the Assyrians and ceased to exist in 722 BC. Okay. He then said about the same time, and by about the same time he meant 500 BC, 200 years later. He said about the same time a colony arrived in Spain called Gadir. And he said, so clearly the Jews from the tribe of Gad went to Spain. Okay. He then went on to argue that when Jesus crossed the Sea of Galilee and went to the land of the Gadarenes, that he actually went across the entire Mediterranean to Spain to visit these Jews from Gad in Spain. And had this whole concocted theory. So I have to correct myself and say, you will see on History Channel documentaries crazy theories about, Now, never mind that it's 222 years later that this group shows up in Spain that has no genetic connection that anyone's shown to being Jewish. But in the first place, if they're deported by the Assyrians, the Assyrian Empire did not quite reach to Spain. Right? In fact, it didn't even touch Europe. So it's kind of, dubious on the face of it. But I thought I should mention, just because I said you wouldn't see it, and then I saw it, that I guess you will see crazy theories like that.
Maybe they fled the Assyrians
to Spain.
200 years later.
Sort of like my ancestors, the Scotch Irish,
Yeah.
all the way across the ocean.
Well, anything's possible, but there's no evidence for it whatsoever. So he just suggested a lot of things. His big proof was that in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, if you go back, not the altar that's used now, but you go back to the old altar, if you could get access back there, there's graffiti on the wall from the 3rd century where they drew a boat. And there's a Latin inscription under the boat that says that the people came in the boat from the west. That's it. That was his big proof. He said, see the west? That could be Spain. It could be.
Also, it could be the shore of the Mediterranean in Israel.
Could be Rome. It could be anywhere. Yeah. So, but that was on. It was on a documentary series called Secrets of Christianity. Like we've been keeping that a secret all this time.
We've only been around about 12,000 years.
No, it was so. There are such things, but moving on to Chronicles that we're going to get into tonight. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, if you read ahead at all, are very weird books. And they're not. Most of the books we've been reading so far, at least, have been pretty straightforward historical narrative. It's a story. Starts at one point in history, goes to another point in history. Chronicles, especially 1st Chronicles, you start out and you've got all these genealogies. Genealogies that start all the way back in Genesis, that parallel ones we've already read, and that run into the future past what we've read. It talks about people who are coming back after the exile's over. Remember last time we just got up to the part where Judah was exiled. So you've got that whole span. Then it sort of shifts gears and starts telling the story of Saul again. So then it goes all the way back to 1 Samuel in terms of the story. And starts telling basically the same story again. And so in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, after all those genealogies, you basically get everything we read in 1 Samuel through 2 Kings, or 1st through 4th Kingdoms in the Orthodox Study Bible. All that stuff sort of compressed again a second time. You might ask, well, what's the point of that? And if you ask what's the point of that, you're not the first one. Because the Jews didn't understand what the point of that was. This is the Greek name for what we now call Chronicles. 1st and 2nd paralepomenon. Paralepomenon in Greek means stuff left over. Okay? So it was 1st and 2nd stuff left over in the Hebrew Bible. And if you get a Hebrew Bible, like they would use at a synagogue, 1st and 2nd stuff left over are the last two books. They're at the very end. Just sort of tacked onto the end. Like, here's some other stuff. Yeah. Here's some other things. Yeah. So it's just sort of tacked onto the end of the Hebrew Bible. Now, you may notice we're getting to it right after 2 Kings or 4th Kingdoms. And that's the place where it's always been in the Christian Bible. Part of this is because Christians have had a different understanding of these two books for a couple of reasons. One is we've got the New Testament. And in the New Testament we've got, for example, the four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which essentially tell the same story four different ways. Right? And also start with genealogies, for that matter, in at least two of the cases. So we have another example of biblical books where the same story is told two different ways right next to each other. And so we, as Christians, could see, oh, well, Mark's version of this story in Jesus' life as compared to Luke's, Mark is emphasizing this, Luke is emphasizing that. Right? They're both bringing out truths out of this. Okay? So traditionally Christians have taken that same perspective on 1st and 2nd Chronicles as they relate to 1 Samuel through 2 Kings. That yes, it's giving us basically the same information, but it's doing it from a slightly different perspective. Some of the details are going to be different. Different things are going to be emphasized. Okay. Second reason Christians have had a different perspective on it is one of the things that's particularly emphasized. Books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles were written much later than 1 Samuel through 2 Kings. As I said, when you read those genealogies at the beginning, it includes things that happened after the return from exile. Okay. So you can imagine a person who is now in exile in Babylon looking back and writing about the history of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Right, what his perspective on things is going to be. We saw how when Israel was first destroyed by the Assyrians, and then when Judah went into exile, the writer sort of went on and on explaining, here's why God did this. Right? Israel really had this coming, because here's all the things Israel did, and God was patient, and they still didn't repent, and so that's why. So the author is sitting in exile saying, you know what? We deserve to be here in exile because of the way we chose to live our lives after God gave us everything. This is how we chose to live our lives. Well, 1st and 2nd Chronicles now is written by someone who's come back from the exile, who's come back and is living in a sort of restored province of Judah. Looking back, so rather than him looking back and trying to justify the fact that he's in exile, because he's not anymore, he's now looking forward. The author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles is looking forward for where he is, sitting in this newly rebuilt province of Judah, newly rebuilt temple, and saying, okay, where is God taking us now? What's next? Where is God leading us into the future? And specifically, he's going to be focusing a lot. We're going to see 1st and 2nd Chronicles focuses a lot more on Judah. Remember, 1st and 2nd Kings, we spent a lot of time in Israel with Elijah and Elisha and their ministries, and with their ministries to the wicked kings in Israel. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is going to focus a lot more on Judah and a lot more on David's line. And so specifically, one of the major emphases of 1st and 2nd Chronicles is that what God is going to do now, that the next promise they're looking forward to is they've rebuilt the temple, they've kind of got a kingdom back, now they're waiting for God to bring the king. They're waiting for God to bring David's descendant, the new king, the Messiah.
Okay.
The Messiah. Okay? And so, obviously from a Christian's perspective, where we believe that God did send the Messiah, Jesus, that makes these books that are sort of pointing to him much more important for us than it is from a Jewish perspective, where there hasn't been a Messiah yet, they would say. And some of them aren't even looking for one particularly now, at this point. So for them, it's stuff left over. You know? For us, we see that there's sort of a key promise being focused on. Okay? So that would be a thing to keep in mind as you read in terms of the main difference is that 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel are looking back at what God did for Israel and how Israel responded. Whereas 1st and 2nd Chronicles are looking forward. They're saying, here's what happened in the past, and what does that tell us about what God has coming. Okay, so it's more messianic, prophetic, pointing towards who the Messiah is going to be. Okay. Now that said, as I said, it starts out with a lot of genealogies. I also mentioned when I talked about going through 1st and 2nd Chronicles before that we're going to go relatively quickly. Because there are big chunks of it that are virtually identical to what we read in 1st and 2nd Kings, for example. So I'm not going to spend a long time just reiterating what I read. I've got them on the internet if you want to go back to revisit 1st and 2nd Kings. Please do. You can go and listen. I'm going to be focusing on the places where it's different. I'm going to be stopping and focusing on the places where either a story is told differently in a significant way, or we get some details that we didn't get before, or in some cases places where we get things that contradict things that we got before. There's going to be a few of those where we're going to be reading along and we're going to say, wait a second, didn't 1st Kings say this other king did that, for example. So those are the things as we go through. We're going to go through more quickly, sort of like we did in Numbers, if you were coming way back then. But we're going to be stopping and focusing on those things that are different. So are there any questions before we get started? You're going through? Okay. So 1 Chronicles 1, verse 1. I'm not going to read the entire genealogy. Now notice the genealogy, it's basically lifted from Genesis, but without the details of how long the people lived. We talked about in Genesis, there was that recurring, whenever we read the genealogies, it would be so-and-so lived so many hundred of years, it'd be some long time, and then he died. And then he died, and then he died, and then he died, and then he died. Because the point those genealogies were trying to make after Adam was that the death that Adam received and Eve received for their sins carried on to their descendants. And so just like he died, they all died. Okay? Here, we're given just names. Right? Because the point here isn't to demonstrate necessarily any point about death. But what we're going to see is this first part of 1 Chronicles is really records keeping. It's records keeping. And we're going to see that, it's going to go through in general, but it's going to trace certain very specific genealogies. Like, for example, the genealogies of the kings of Judah. Why? Because, well, we're waiting for the next king of Judah, and he's going to need to be he's going to need to be one of David's descendants. And the line of the priests, the Levites, who are the real high priests going back to Aaron. Right? So it's going to focus in on these particular genealogies. And so the point isn't so much, with a few exceptions, there are a few times where it will stop and focus on a particular person. But for the most part, as it just runs along, the point is just to show the continuity. The idea that there was this continuity, like the line of Judah's kings, there was this continuity. The priests, there was this continuity. The individual names as such aren't really the emphasis. And again, there will be some exceptions that where an individual, it stops and mentions them. So we get a real quick at the first 3 verses. We get the people who are mentioned in Genesis before Noah. Okay. And then when we get to Noah, it focuses in first, not on the sons of Shem. Remember, Abraham is descended from Shem. That's where we get the word Semitic. To describe those groups of people, Semitic means descended from Shem. Okay. It focuses not on those first, but it focuses on the others. Okay, first on Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. And we talked back in Genesis how Japheth, the name Japheth, is connected to the Greek name Eopater, which was in the Indo-European understanding was their forefather, was the forefather of all human beings. It's the same name. Okay? So Japheth's descendants are the Indo-Europeans, which includes both people from Europe and people from India, China, those areas. Okay. No. No. Okay. In fact, under the sons of Javan in verse 7, Tarshish, there, the city of Tarshish is in North Africa, right across the Straits of Gibraltar. So if there are any Spaniards, they're related to Japheth here. Okay. Then it lists in verse 8 the sons of Ham. Remember, Ham was the son who sinned. But notice the names of his descendants are the names of nations. Cush, which is what's now Ethiopia. Mizraim, which is the Hebrew name for Egypt. Put, and Canaan. Okay. So, under Ham, in this genealogy at least, you find all the quote-unquote bad guys. Right? Who are the bad guys in the Old Testament so far? First the Egyptians, then the Canaanites. Right? And when they break it down here, verse 13, Canaan was the father of Sidon, his firstborn. Well, what's Sidon? Sidon is one of the capitals of the Phoenician Empire, right? Phoenicians, bad guys. Sidon is where Jezebel was from. Okay. So all of these bad guy nations come from Ham in this genealogy. Okay, and then finally in verse 17, then it goes into the sons of Shem, works its way down to Abraham in verse 27. Okay. And then from Abraham in verse 28, Isaac and Ishmael. It breaks down and then goes down to verse 43. Verse 43, remember we had Jacob and we had Esau. And Esau became the father of the Edomites. Remember we talked about Edom as sort of the Israelites' neighbor to the southeast. And so in verse 43 it gives us the list of the Edomite kings. List of the Edomite kings. Who their leaders were. Okay. Chapter 2, when we get to chapter 2, verse 1, it then goes to Jacob, who God gave the name Israel. And of course we've got the tribes listed there. But notice then it's going to follow Judah in particular. Why is it following Judah? Because David's line is going to come from Judah. Remember, Saul was a Benjamite. So it's not all kings, but it's David's line is going to come from Judah. So Judah's line is the one that's particularly important to the person who's putting together Chronicles. Okay. Now, listen to how this is described. You may remember the actual story from Genesis. So the sons of Judah were Onan, and Shelah. These three were born to him by Bathshua, a Canaanite woman. Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Tamar, Judah's daughter-in-law, bore him Perez and Zerah. Judah had 5 sons in all. And then it goes right to the sons of Perez. Does anybody remember that story from back in Genesis? What happened was, Judah's firstborn son, was wicked, as it says. And so he died young. And we talked about how at that time they had what was called Levitt Marriage. So if your brother was married to a woman and died without leaving an heir to his estate, because the estate was handed down from father to firstborn son to his firstborn son, then it was your responsibility as the brother to marry your brother's wife and give him an heir. But so the first son you had with that woman wasn't your heir, it was your dead brother's heir. Okay? Meaning instead of you as second son inheriting your father's house, your dead brother's son inherits it. Okay? So Onan was the second son in this case. And Onan decided, well, hey, if I don't get her pregnant, then I'm going to inherit everything as the second son. So he went in to sleep with her and took matters into his own hands to make sure that there was no way she could get pregnant as a result of the act. Right? To not go into gory details. Okay? Well, because God saw him do this thing, which is essentially a sin against his dead brother, out of his own greed, God struck him dead. Okay? So what Judah was supposed to do was Judah was then supposed to have his third son marry this woman and give her a son. Okay, but Judah looked at it and said, this girl's jinxed. Everybody who marries her dies. I'm not going to have my third son marry her. So he just sent her back to her family. Okay, so Judah did wrong by her. Okay. So when the time came for the sheep shearing festival, we're told, Tamar went out and dressed like a prostitute with a veil on the side of the road, saw Judah coming by and lured him into her tent and kept his walking stick and his signet ring when he left. Okay. So then she got pregnant. Well, she gets in trouble because she's pregnant out of wedlock now. So they haul her in front of the elders of the city for having gotten pregnant. And they bring Judah out there, because Judah's her father-in-law, for Judah to condemn her, right, to be stoned to death. And Judah comes out, and he's all mad. How dare she go and get pregnant? And then she pulls out the walking stick and the signet ring and says, these belong to the guy who got me pregnant. and Judah said, no, right? Yeah. And he said, and he answers, she's the one who's in the right, not me. So he repented and accepted. That's true. Because he owed her that son. He owed her that son to be an heir to as well. Now, all of that story, all of that chicanery, all that messing about, where was that in verses 3 and 4 there? It's not there. This is the first example of something we're going to see in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is sort of the sanitized version. It's not going to lie. I mean, it says here that it was Tamar, his daughter-in-law, who bore him those sons, right? That's true, right? It's not reporting false information. It's just not reporting all the details as to how that happened. to make Judah look a little better. Okay?
Does it mention Bathsheba anywhere?
No. So we're going to see there's going to be a lot of particularly the kings of Judah, the people in Judah's line, David's line, because remember, this is the line the Messiah is going to come from. We're going to kind of pass over some of the things that they do without talking about them as much as we did in 1st and 2nd Kings, right? So this is something to be aware. We're going to notice this again. This is just the first major instance where we're going to sort of pass over some things in silence. Yeah. So the line continues through Perez there in verse 5, okay, and goes down to Akar. Remember, who is in the book of Joshua, who kept the things that were supposed to be destroyed, rather than destroying all the gold and wealth. When they came to the town of Ai, he decided to keep some for himself, and so because of that, he brought destruction on Israel. That's what that references to. Then goes down in verses 11 and 12, we meet our friend Boaz, remember from the book of Ruth. Notice again, there's no mention of Ruth. There's no mention that he married a Moabite, because a Moabite's a foreigner. So again, we just kind of pass over that. There's this continuity going through Judah of Jewish folk. Verse 13, we've got Jesse, David's father, goes through his brothers and sisters. Verse 18, that basically brings us up to David. David's in verse 15. Okay. Then it stops and steps back for a minute. Remember Caleb, 18, remember Caleb. Caleb was the other spy with Joshua, who came back when they sent the 12 spies into the land. They came back and 10 of them said, no way, no how, we ain't going back there. It's full of giants. They've all got iron chariots. They're 30 feet tall. They'll kill us all. And Joshua and Caleb said, they're pretty tough, but we got God on our side so we can do it. Okay. And remember the last time we saw Caleb in the book of Joshua, he went and found the most fortified town where all the giants lived and said, I'm going to go take that one, when he was 80 years old. And went and led them into battle and captured it. And that city was Hebron, which, remember back in 2 Samuel, Hebron was where David originally reigned as king, before he captured Jerusalem and made Jerusalem his capital. So verse 18, it steps back and it gives us the genealogy of Caleb, because these are the people in Hebron, the important city. Okay, so that runs through. They restart a couple times because Caleb had a few wives and a few concubines. So you can see in verse 46, we've got another concubine, 48 another concubine. Verse 50, more descendants. That basically brings us to chapter 3. Chapter 3, cut back to David. David's in Hebron. Okay. So we sort of have set up, he used those two genealogies to set up, here's who David is descended from, here's where Hebron came from. Now David's in Hebron. And he's reigning. And we pick up with David's sons. Okay, by his various wives. And so we have the sons born to him while he was in Hebron, then when he was in Jerusalem. Then of course we trace through Solomon, and if you look at verse 10 through verse 16, right, you've got all the kings we talked about in 1st and 2nd Kings in terms of Judah. Right, all the way from Rehoboam to Zedekiah. Okay. So now verse 17, remember where we ended up. Judah went into exile. Jehoiakim was the surviving king, and he was living, albeit under house arrest, but he was living in Babylon. Okay. Well, here in verse 17, we pick up with Jehoiachin. We pick up with him and his descendants. Okay. So now, up till now, we've been talking about stuff we already talked about before. This is now actually going forward from where we left off last time. Okay? In verse 17. So the sins of Jehoiachin the captive, these are while he was in Babylon. Okay? That runs through his genealogy there up to verse 24. Okay? And we're going to see, at the very end of 2 Chronicles, we're going to see a couple of these guys. As we go forward into Ezra and Nehemiah, when we get to the book of Daniel, we're going to see a number of these people who are listed here as his descendants, as we work our way up to the Judahites going back to the Promised Land. Okay. So chapter 4, we back way up again. This is one of the reasons why people weren't sure what to do. It's like, this is just a bunch of genealogies all thrown together, right? They aren't even in order. So we back up again to Judah. And this time we trace a slightly different line. Okay? Now verse 9, chapter 4, verse 9. I don't know how many folks remember this. But back about 12, 13 years ago, there was a huge popular Christian movement based on the next 2 verses. Okay? About this, there's this man Jabez. Somebody wrote a book back around 1998, 99 called The Prayer of Jabez. Right? And that was coming out of these 2 verses in the middle of these genealogies and Chronicles. Somebody found them, probably by accident. But so what it says here is it just stops in this genealogy. It says, Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. His mother had named him Jabez. Jabez means pain or suffering. So that's a nice name to give your kid. But she did that because she said, I gave birth to him in pain. If everybody followed that, there'd be a lot more kids named Pain. But so we read in verse 10, Jabez cried out to the God of Israel, Oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my territory. Let your hand be with me and keep me from harm, so that I will be free from pain. And God granted his request. Okay? So we have this little stop, this little prayer of Jabez, okay, which was then blown up into a movement where this little prayer he prayed was treated like it was sort of a magical talisman. You were supposed to pray it like, 20 times a day or something like that. Pray it over and over and over again every day. And God would enlarge your territory, meaning give you money, and keep you from experiencing pain, supposedly. Okay. Now, how you would get that out of this context, that's what God wants you to do with this, I don't know. Right? The idea that you would pull that out and say, well, if I just pray this enough, God will have to do it. But I mean, that encompasses your whole view of God and prayer and everything. I mean, we don't pray to try to manipulate God into doing what we want, hopefully. And we don't think that if we say the same thing often enough, he finally does, okay. Give me money, give me money, give me, okay, here's some money, But, well, God. Yeah. But the idea here is not parrot what this guy said. But again, we have to take it in the context. When is this being written? Okay, this is being written by one of a pretty small group. We're going to find out how small here in a minute. A pretty small group that leaves the Persian Empire, okay, travels farther than Abraham did originally to get back to the land, okay, is living there in what is still part of the Persian Empire, but is essentially trying to rebuild their whole society. Okay, it's trying to rebuild their whole society. The big temptation for those people, and we're going to see a lot of this in Ezra and Nehemiah, which are the next books we're going to read after 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The big temptation for those people is going to be to go back to that land and just sort of blend in with the people who are already there. right? Just sort of settle down, get the farm, worship whoever they're worshiping, right? Do whatever they're doing. Eat with them, intermarry with them, right? What that group believes God wants them to do is to come back and not really reestablish, because as we saw, it didn't go that great the first time, but establish for the first time a community that's based on the law that he gave them. Right? A community that will succeed where the last one failed. That will be a light to the other nations. That will follow and worship God. That'll be separate and different. So that the other gods will come and worship their God too. Okay? So this prayer, this idea of enlarging their territory, okay, enlarging your territory in the context when Jabez lived at the time of Joshua, and in the context when these people are living, when Chronicles is being written, means probably you're going to have to go out and fight. At least defensively. At least defend yourself from the other people around you. You're going to have to go out and struggle against the culture you're now smack in the middle of, to try to live a holy life and to try to have this separate and different kind of community. Okay, so expanding his territory and being free from pain means protect me from these people trying to kill me, right? And give me the strength to help build this community. Okay. So that, in context, is what this is about. So if you want to pray the prayer of Jabez, and what you mean by it when you pray to God is, God, give me the strength and the courage to be able to live the kind of life, the kind of holy life in this world that you want me to live. And protect me from the temptations and everything else that are coming at me from that world to try to destroy me. Great, pray the prayer of Jabez and mean that. Okay.
Not for the $20 bill.
But it's not about getting a $20 bill. It's not about getting money.
How did they go there?
And it's not about not getting sick physically. Yeah. It's about actual spiritual warfare. It's about trying to live, in this case a Jewish, in our case a Christian life in a world that's hostile. It's hostile to who Christ is. So that's one of our little stops. And then it picks up again immediately. Verse 13, you notice Othniel, remember he was the first judge in the book of Judges. He was one of the very few good ones. Goes on. Goes on to in verse 22. It stops up again with Joachim, the men of Kozeba and Joash and Saraph, who ruled in Moab and Jeshui Lechem. These records are from ancient times. They were the potters who lived at Netaim and Gedera. They stayed there and worked for the king. Okay, so who are these people now? So we've just had this whole we went all the way back to Judah again to get the genealogy of these guys who make pots. Why? From the ancient records. Again, and we're going to see this in more detail in a minute, they've come back to the land. One of the things they're doing is trying to rebuild the temple. Okay. So it's important to them even that the people who are going to come and are going to make the things that are going to be used in the temple, the bowls, right, the cups, the decorations, the altar, it's important that the people that there's a continuity between the people who made those for the first temple and the people who are going to make them now. Okay? We're not just getting some random people to put our new temple together. Continuity. Okay? The whole thing that's being stressed is this continuity. Okay? So verse 24, we go back to Simeon. Okay, we go forward and we trace genealogy of Simeon in order to get to, in verse 38, The men listed above by name were leaders of their clans. Their families increased greatly, and they went to the outskirts of Gedor, to the east of the valley, in search of pasture for their flocks. They found rich, good pasture, and the land was spacious, peaceful, and quiet. Some Hamites had lived there formerly. The men whose names were listed came in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah. They attacked the Hamites in their dwellings, and also the Munites who were there, and completely destroyed them, as is evident to this day. Then they settled in their place, because there was pasture for their flocks. And 500 of these Simeonites, led by Pelatiah, Neariah, Rephaiah, and Uzziel, the sons of Ishi, invaded the hill country of Seir. They killed the remaining Amalekites who had escaped, and they have lived there to this day. So this little thing from Simeon, this little genealogy, is one of the groups of people who they found there when they got back from the Persian Empire. Okay? These are essentially like the Samaritans. They're people who are distantly related to Simeon. There's been a lot of interbreeding. They've been living in these Gentile areas. Okay? And the point of this little expansion is to say, oh, they showed up and helped Hezekiah. So they're not quite as bad as the Samaritans and some of those other guys. Right? Try to show that they're connected to the old kingdom. Meaning this group of people who we found here, they're kind of our cousins, and we can live with. They're okay folk. They're okay folk. They're sort of kin to us. Okay. Now that raises the question: are these people actually kin to them? Okay. This is something we're going to see going forward here. Not just in Chronicles, but in Ezra and Nehemiah. And there's going to be a really good example of it in First Maccabees. Okay. We talked about how Caleb, remember whose genealogy we also just read, who was from the tribe of Judah, was actually a Canaanite. Remember back? When he first shows up, he's a Canaanite. Then all of a sudden he's in the tribe of Judah. Because when you chose to worship Israel's God, and you entered into a covenant with Israel, you became part of Israel. Okay. This is going to go to the point in First Maccabees. This is going to be an extreme example. The little nation of Judea at that time is going to make a peace treaty with the Spartans, the ones from 300. Same Spartans, the ones in Greece. Okay. And in the letter that they send to the Spartans, they refer to the Spartans as their fellow descendants from Abraham. Okay. Now, looking at every genealogy we've looked at, right, in the whole Bible, you'd say, what? The Spartans? Okay. The point being, as soon as the Spartans enter into that covenant agreement with Judea, they become family. They become family. Okay? So, can we be absolutely sure this tribe of people, the people named above, as they're referred to, if we could go back in time with genetic DNA testing, that they would be Jewish? Not really. But what's important is both now, at the time this is being written, and in the time of Hezekiah, these people came and sided with Israel and helped Israel and are now worshiping Israel's God. So as far as the writer of First Chronicles is concerned, they're now family. They're now part of the tribe of Simeon. Whether that's by blood descent or not. Okay.
Why even this far back did they feel they had to justify that? Like when Moses first went out of Egypt, whoever went with them then, okay.
Yeah.
So
Grandfathered in, yeah.
So why didn't they just say, okay, if you want to do it, then you're part of the tribe? Like why did they try to tie it in now?
Well, because they've got two competing things. They've got when you're here, your family, right? When you're here, our God, you're part of the family. And on the other side, they're very serious, especially at this time, as they're coming back and trying to form this new community, about following the law. What does the law say? You can't marry Gentiles. Gentiles are unclean. You can't be around them. So if these people here above named are Gentiles, your daughters can't marry their sons, right? They can't come in to the temple. Okay? So that's why it's important to establish, well, they're not really, these guys aren't really Gentiles. These guys here. And here's why. They're us, not them.
That they made a deal with them, so
Right.
when they brought them in, that canceled
Right.
everything else out.
So if I'm Shlomo the farmer who came back from Persia, and my daughter wants to marry the son of one of the people named above, that's fine. She's not running off and marrying a Gentile, right? Because these people are part of us. That's the importance of it. So they've got two competing things going on. It's sort of like if, you know, and I know this has happened in English history, right? Someone in the English royal family wants to marry someone who's basically a commoner, and all of a sudden all the genealogists come out of the woodwork to try to prove that somehow, you know, they're the 8th cousin of Frederick III from Prussia or something. So, oh, see, they're really from a noble family. You can marry them, it's fine. It's the same kind of thing. It's the same kind of thing. It's these people are part of us and on our side, so let's, you know, bring them into our history.
Can it be kind of compared to, maybe I'm way off, but like Christians were grafted into the Jewish,
Right.
is it kind of
Right.
graft?
Yeah, that's part of what I've been talking about. And now we get to it again. I was talking about that back in Exodus, where we saw these people being grafted in. That isn't a new thing all of a sudden in the New Testament. I mean, that happened with Ruth. You know, that happened with, all along we see these people who are technically outside, ethnically or racially, but who get brought in. And of course the prophecy, remember, at the time of Noah with Ham, wasn't just that Shem was going to have the promises, but that he was going to throw open his tents to Japheth. Meaning what? Meaning, again, the idea was that Israel was supposed to bring all the other nations in to worship God too. They were just supposed to be special off sitting in a corner not talking to anyone. They were supposed to bring everyone else in too. So that bringing in and that grafting in has been the point all along. Has been part of how God works all along. But so this is another example of a group of people getting grafted in, getting brought in.
Becoming Jewish.
Yeah. For what we would call today becoming Jewish, yeah.
Well, at that point in time, though, what was they going to do? They'd all been shipped
Right.
everywhere.
Yeah, that's
You know, you're not going to go to this town and say, oh, you Jews come here. They might not be but 10 or 20 Jews there, and then they move them on someplace else.
right. And
You
over
got to
the,
repopulate somewhere.
and I didn't give the dates yet, but remember 586 BC was the last deportation from Judah. Okay, they come back starting in 516. 70 years. They're gone. So in that 70 years, even the Jewish people who stayed behind, that's how we ended up with the Samaritans. Even the people who were of Jewish ethnicity who stayed behind started intermarrying with, so you've got 2 generations there where people have been intermarrying. And so when you show back up there, is this guy a Jew or not? You know? Well, his grandfather was. You know? Is he now? Well, in the case of these men here above named, they are. They're considered Jews. Okay, so chapter 5, we back up again. Chapter 5, we go all the way back again first to Reuben. Okay. Now here we get a note. This is one that doesn't get covered up. And this is a really interesting note. Verse 1, the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel. He was the firstborn, but when he defiled his father's marriage bed, his rights as firstborn were given to the sons of Joseph, son of Israel. so he could not be listed in the genealogical record in accordance with his birthright. And though Judah was the strongest of his brothers and a ruler came from him, the rights of the firstborn belonged to Joseph. This is another, we got to go back to when we were talking about Genesis a year and a half ago. But we talked, Reuben slept with one of his father's concubines. Okay, which was seen as pretty much, we saw this happen with Absalom too, David's son. This is pretty much the greatest slap in the face of disrespect you could give to your father in this culture. Okay. So because of that, Reuben was not considered the firstborn. And we talked about how it went Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah in birth order. And Simeon and Levi, remember, were the ones who masterminded the slaughter of all the men of Shechem when they wanted revenge for what the men of Shechem did to their sister. And so they were condemned by their father for doing that. So that brought us down to Judah. And we saw how the king came from Judah. What's interesting here is this note doesn't say, therefore the firstborn went to Judah and that's why the king came from Judah. He says the status of firstborn went to Joseph. He was the second to the last born. Okay. Now remember when we talked about Genesis, we talked about how the whole last third of the book of Genesis is the story of Joseph. Okay. And then how we go forward into the Old Testament, and all of a sudden Joseph's descendants disappear. Remember he had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Haven't heard much about them. A lot of Judah, a lot of Benjamin, a lot of Levi. Right? Because those are the ones that survive. Not a lot of Manasseh and Ephraim. Okay? But at the time I made a note, as related to this, we're going to see when we get to the book of Psalms, that the oldest Psalms, okay, like the ones written by Moses, for example, the oldest Psalms don't refer to Israel, the people who came out of Egypt, as Israel. They refer to them as Ephraim. They refer to them as Ephraim. At the time of the Exodus, and we went through it, noted this when we were going through Exodus, Ephraim was the largest tribe. The tribe of firstborn son. And if you remember, when we got to the land and they were divvying up the land, Ephraim had the largest portion because it had the most people, even at that point. Okay. So, when it talks about Joseph receiving the birthright, that's what it's talking about. When the time came to divvy up the promised land, the biggest chunk, especially if you add what Ephraim got to what Manasseh got. Remember, Manasseh was on the east side of the Jordan River. So if you add that to the biggest portion, which was Ephraim's, pretty much half of the promised land that was distributed went to Joseph's descendants. So that's what that's referring to. And that's why Joseph is so important in the book of Genesis. Even though his descendants don't end up being the kings or the high priests or the other quote-unquote important people in the histories in terms of population and in terms of amount of land they received. They were the biggest. Okay, and that's what this blessing of the firstborn is. Okay. But we go through this then from Reuben. Verse 17, all these were entered in the genealogical records during the reigns of Jotham, king of Judah, and Jeroboam, king of Israel. The Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Remember, Manasseh and Ephraim were both considered half-tribes because they were both descended from Joseph.
Can you clarify something? Maybe
Sure.
I'm on the wrong track, but in the New Testament, doesn't it speak of Ephraim as the smallest and insignificant, such as why Jesus would be buried?
That's Ephrathah. Ephrathah, which is the area that Bethlehem is in.
Yes.
Which is, but that's in Judah's territory. Yeah, Ephrathah. Okay, so the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh had 44,760 men ready for military service. Able-bodied men who could handle shield and sword and could use a bow and who were trained for battle. They waged war against the Hagrites, Jeter, Naphish, and Nodab. They were helped in fighting them, and God handed the Hagrites and all their allies over to them because they cried out to him during the battle. He answered their prayers because they trusted in him. They seized the livestock of the Hagrites, 50,000 camels, 250,000 sheep, and 2,000 donkeys. They also took 100,000 people captive, and many others fell slain because the battle was God's. And they occupied the land until the exile. The people of the half-tribe of Manasseh were numerous. They settled in the land from Bashan to Baal Hermon, that is to Center. These were the heads of their families. They list them. They were brave warriors, famous men, and heads of their families. But they were unfaithful to the God of their fathers and prostituted themselves to the gods of the peoples of the land, whom God had destroyed before them. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, that is Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, who took the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh into exile. He took them to Hala, Habor, Hara, and the river of Gozan, where they are to this day. Okay. So now we have this little genealogy. Remember all these people who were important, the descendants of Joseph, the descendants of Reuben, all their military exploits. Well, they were wicked, so now they're gone. And they're still gone at the time this is being written. Right? None of them have returned. So that's the point there. That's, in case you just read the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and you're wondering where Joseph's descendants are and Reuben's descendants are and these other people's descendants are, the Assyrians wiped them out, and they never came back.
Reuben has a sandwich named after him.
He did get a sandwich, but that's not the same. Not the same. So chapter 6, we go back and start with Levi. Why do you imagine we're going to go through Levi's genealogy? These are the priests. The priests, right? So we need a continuity of priests if we're going to get a temple going again, the way God wanted it to be. Okay, so it starts with sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Verse 3, it hits the sons of Aaron. It goes all the way up. Verse 15, Jehozadak was deported when the Lord sent Judah and Jerusalem into exile by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. So that's your list of high priests. Right, showing there's this continuity of high priests up until the exile. Then we go back and start with Levi again. It runs through another genealogy. Verse 31, these are the men David put in charge of the music in the house of the Lord after the ark came to rest there. They ministered with music before the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, until Solomon built the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. They performed their duties according to the regulations laid down for them. So now, genealogy of our musicians. There's a continuity between the music we're going to have in the new temple and the music that was in the old temple that David started writing. Okay. Again, this emphasis on continuity, even in these quote-unquote little things. Not just the king and the high priest, but the guys who make the bowls, the guys who make the music. Here are the men who served together with their sons. Gives this big list of musicians. Their fellow Levites were assigned to all the other duties of the tabernacle, the house of God, but Aaron and his descendants were the ones who presented offerings on the altar of burnt offering and on the altar of incense in connection with all that was done in the most holy place, making atonement for Israel in accordance with all that Moses, the servant of God, had commanded. Now again, that's a little whitewashed, we know, right? That's sort of what they were supposed to do. We know they were up to a lot of other stuff, over the time period described. But that was what they were supposed to do. And so, from the perspective of the person writing First Chronicles, here's what their descendants are going to do now. Right? This is their legacy. This is what they're inheriting. Okay. And we go again starting with Aaron, the descendants. These were the locations of their settlements allotted as their territory. They were assigned to the descendants of Aaron, who were from the Kohathite clan, because the first lot was for them. Remember, even though they didn't get a chunk of the land, Levites didn't get a chunk of the land, the other tribes gave them cities to live in, because they still needed places to live, right, with their families and everything. So they were given cities to live in. And so these are the these are the cities that they're listing here. They were given Hebron and Judah with its surrounding pasture lands, but the fields and villages around the city were given to Caleb, son of Jephunneh. So the descendants of Aaron were given Hebron. This is the other cities. From the tribe of Benjamin, they were given another list. These towns, which were distributed among the Kohathite clans, were 13 in all. The rest of Kohath's descendants were allotted 10 towns from the clans of half the tribe of Manasseh. The descendants of Gershon, clan by clan, were allotted 13 towns. It goes through and lists those original allotments. Okay. And they list all of those all the way through okay, well, let's cut down to because what happens, the names of the cities continue until the end of chapter 6. Those are all the cities given to the Levites. Right? It lists the ones that lists first, the ones from Judah and Benjamin, are the ones that are important because those are the ones that they would be expected to live in now when Judah and Benjamin come back. Then it lists all the ones from the other tribes, like on the other side of the Jordan, which are somewhat less important because they don't have that territory right now. But theoretically could be. Theoretically could be. If the people came back, right? There's every reason to believe that if they actually followed God's covenant this time and obeyed, God might give them those cities back, in which case they should go back to the Levites, is the idea there. Okay, so then starting at chapter 7, it gives descendants of all the tribes of Israel that now at this point no longer exist. Okay, and what towns they possessed and where they were. That one's all the way up to the end of chapter 8. Okay. It's just genealogical record keeping for all those. Okay. So chapter 9, verse 1, all Israel was listed in the genealogies recorded in the book of the kings of Israel. So that's referring to what we just saw. So that's all the Israelites. The people of Judah were taken captive to Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. Now the first to resettle on their own property in their own towns were some Israelites, priests, Levites, and temple servants. Those from Judah, from Benjamin, and from Ephraim and Manasseh who lived in Jerusalem were... Okay, now it's going to give a list. Okay. And what's important here, there are a few numbers. Chapter 9, verse 6, there are 690 people from Judah. This is the first group of people who returned in 516. Okay. So now we're leaping ahead in time again. We've been going these genealogies back to the past. Now we're leaping ahead to after the exile. Okay. After the exile, then the first group to come back, the tribe of Judah, we've got 690. Now, take a look at that for a second. We went from the nation of Judah, which used to roll out hundreds of thousands of troops for a battle. Okay. Tribe of Judah now has 690 people. Okay. Of the Benjamites, verse 9, 956. So less than 1,000. Of the priests, verse 13, 1,760. From the priestly families. And of the Levites, down in verse 22, altogether when you add up the other Levites who weren't priests, 212. And in the verses there, this is list the gatekeepers and those kinds of, the other jobs that Levites did who weren't priests. related to the temple and to worship. Okay, so if you add all this up, you get 3,618 people. That's not even a town. Right? That's not even a town. That's how many people came back in the first group to try to rebuild the nation of Judah in 516. So you can imagine some of those things I was talking about, like not blending into the people who are around where they're living. They're this tiny, fragile community. Right? Trying to do some pretty ambitious goals. Right? Try to rebuild the temple, reestablish a monarchy. Right? This tiny group. And so when we get into, now most of First and Second Chronicles is not going to be talking about these people. Right? It's going to be, we're going to be going back into the past again and going through Saul, David, Solomon, their descendants, the kings. But these are the people who are writing this, and these are the people we're going to read about in 1st and 2nd Ezra and in Nehemiah. These are the people we're going to be reading about. These people who come back to try to start over. Okay. For now, keep in mind, this is how many people we're talking about. Like, a lot of schools have a bigger enrollment than that.
That's all that's left of the Jewish people.
At that point, yeah.
At that point.
Now this is, to be fair, this is men. So if all of them were married, you can double that. If they had an average of one child, you can triple it, but you're still only at around 10,000 people, counting children. And children aren't going to be able to swing a sword when the Edomites come running in. Right? Well, some of the women are going to have to. We're going to see. But that's okay. So it goes on. It talks about their various assignments. Lists the heads of the Levite families. Okay. And that brings us up to, now in chapter 10, beginning of chapter 10, the whole book switches gears. And again, this is a reason why people have been historically kind of confused by this book. We just got this whole genealogical buildup talking about these people. So if we're reading along, we're kind of geared up for, okay, well, what's going to happen to these people who have come back from exile to the promised land? And now all of a sudden it's going to talk about the Philistines attacking Israel and Saul fighting them. You're like, wait, what? So now all of a sudden we're going back from 516 BC to about 1000 BC. Just jumping back again. Jumping back again to the time when Saul is king. Jonathan, his son, is still alive. Okay. And that starts in 10 verse 1. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and abuse me." Now again, that isn't cleaned up by First Chronicles. That's cleaned up by modern English translators. These uncircumcised fellows will come and abuse me. Uncircumcised fellows is not exactly what it says. And abuse is a nice way of putting it. But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died. So Saul and 3 of his sons died, and all his house died together. When all the Israelites in the valley saw that the army had fled, and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his sons fallen on Mount Gilboa, They stripped him and took his head and his armor and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news among their idols and their people. They put his armor in the temple of their gods and hung up his head in the temple of Dagon. When all the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of everything the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men went and took the bodies of Saul and his sons and brought them to Jabesh. Then they buried their bones under the great tree in Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord. He did not keep the word of the Lord, and even consulted a medium for guidance, and did not inquire of the Lord. So the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, son of Jesse. Okay? A little bit of sanitization there, right? We don't get the whole story of Saul trying to kill David, chasing him all over the countryside, right? Trying to murder him. We don't get any of that. He dies, and we're told he died because he was bad, because he was wicked. God took his life and took the kingdom away from him, right? And we're given one of the reasons. He consulted with a medium, remember, the witch of Endor. Okay? But that's it. This makes it look like a pretty clean transition, right? Saul dies in battle. Oh, now David's king. Right? Again, there's nothing untrue about that. Right? All the details given are this match the details we were given back in 2 Samuel, but there's a lot of stuff that's just sort of glossed over. Okay? Now, if you think that was glossed over, chapter 11, verse 1, all Israel came together to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, even while Saul was king, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord your God said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, he made a compact with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel as the Lord had promised through Samuel. Does that sound like what quite going to happen? Where everybody just all came together and said, "We love that David. Let's all go make him king." And he said, "Oh, sure, guys, I love you too. I'll be your king." And everyone was happy. I remember something about one of Saul's sons trying to take over in a civil war, and Joab sticking some people. And yeah, there was a whole lot of other stuff that happened there, right? Again, we kind of glossed over. And remember how when we were reading about David, already the 10 northern tribes weren't real happy with him ever. Remember? But now it's, all Israel came to David and they were all happy. They were glad to have him as king. David, great guy. Again, not necessarily not true. He was made king in Hebron, right? He was the military leader under Saul. He was popular, right? But a little triumphalistic, right? A little cleaned up, right? Now this shouldn't be too strange to us because, for example, if you've studied American history, like actually studied it, you know that a lot of the popular versions of stories we get have been cleaned up a little bit. You know, George Washington with the cherry tree, you know, Washington crossing the dog. A lot of these things. It's not that they're not true, so a lot of them. It's that, you know, there are a lot of details that get left out in the popular telling, right? Like Washington crossing the Delaware, we say, "Oh, what a brave, glorious scene." We don't know it was Christmas Day and there was supposed to be a truce, right? And he basically ambushed and massacred a bunch of the British who were celebrating Christmas. You know.
Germans.
Hessians, yeah. You don't talk about that part. Right?
If they're being Germans, they really had to be totally wiped out.
Yeah. So we just leave a few of the details out, right? You know, it's a cleaner story, right? If you just, that's the same kind of thing here. It's a cleaner story if just everyone in Israel just comes to David and says, "Hey, be our king," and he's like, "Sure," and everyone's happy. So verse 4, David and all the Israelites marched to Jerusalem. That is, Jebus, the Jebusites who lived there, said to David, "You will not get in here." Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, the city of David. Right? So they just all, right after they made him king, they just all marched over to Jerusalem. Right? And the Jebusites in Jerusalem said, "You'll never take our city," but he took it anyway. Again, shortened kind of in brief version. David had said, whoever leads the attack on the Jebusites will become commander-in-chief. Joab, son of Zeruiah, went up first, and so he received the command. David then took up residence in the fortress, and so it was called the City of David. He built up the city around it from the supporting terraces to the surrounding wall, while Joab restored the rest of the city. And David became more and more powerful because the Lord Almighty was with him. Okay. So again, a long kind of struggle, a lot of dark moments, a lot of betrayal and things going on. We just have kind of simplified. These were the chiefs of David's mighty men. They, together with all Israel, gave his kingship strong support to extend it over the whole land, as the Lord had promised. This is the list of David's mighty men. Jashabim, a Hakmonite, was chief to the officers. He raised his spear against 300 men, whom he killed in one encounter. Next to him was Eleazar, son of Dodai the Ahohite, one of the 3 mighty men. He was with David at Pasdamim when the Philistines gathered there for battle. At a place where there was a field full of barley, the troops fled from the Philistines. But they took their stand in the middle of the field, they defended it and struck the Philistines down, and the Lord brought about a great victory. 3 of the 30 chiefs came down to David to the rock at the cave of Adullam, while a band of Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. At that time David was in the stronghold, and the Philistine garrison was at Bethlehem. David longed for water and said, "Oh, that someone would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem." So the 3 broke through the Philistine lines, drew water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem, and carried it back to David. But he refused to drink it. Instead, he poured it out before the Lord. "God forbid that I should do this," he said. "Should I drink the blood of these men who went at the risk of their lives? Because they risked their lives to bring it back. David would not drink it." Such were the exploits of the 3 mighty men. Right, now these are actually, that individual story was actually back in 2 Samuel too. But here it's, look at the kind of awesome stuff David and his buddies used to go and do back in the good old days, right? Because again, this David here in Chronicles, remember we talked about how in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, it's a guy in exile looking back. And he's looking back and saying, you know what? Even when David was king, things weren't all that hot, right? So he's remembering a lot of the gory details. Even back then, things were kind of messed up, right? Whereas now, Chronicles is looking forward. It's looking forward to what? A descendant of David, the Messiah, who's going to come and reign on his throne, right? So for him, back when David is king, that's the golden age, right? That's the golden, that's what we want back. These 3,600, they dream of getting back to what it was like when David was king. These 3,618 people. That's their hope. Their wildest hope is that they could get back to the way things were with David. So again, that gives you a different perspective on David. Verse 20, Abishai, the brother of Joab, was a chief of the 3. He raised his spear against 300 men whom he killed, so he became as famous as the 3. He was doubly honored above the 3 and became their commander, even though he was not included among them. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was a valiant fighter from Kabzeel who performed great exploits. He struck down 2 of Moab's best men. He also went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. On a snowy day, even.
But he walked both ways, 3 feet of snow.
Yeah.
Right?
Into a pit. A snow-filled pit of some sort. He struck down an Egyptian who was 7.5 feet tall. Although the Egyptian had a spear like a weaver's rod in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. He snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. Such were the exploits of Benaiah, son of Jehoiada. He too was as famous as the 3 mighty men. He was held in greater honor than any of the 30, but he was not included among the 3, and David put him in charge of his bodyguard. There we have a list of all the 30 mighty men. Chapter 12, verse 1. These were the men who came to David at Ziklag while he was banished from the presence of Saul, son of Kish. They were among the warriors who helped him in battle. They were armed with bows and were able to shoot arrows or to sling stones right-handed or left-handed. They were ambidextrous to boot. They were kinsmen of Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. So here we get this passing mention when David was banished from the presence of Saul. We didn't hear anything about the actual story. There's just this passing reference here that's when these men first hooked up with David. He gives a list again. Some Gadites defected to David at his stronghold in the desert. They were brave warriors ready for battle and able to handle the shield and spear. Their faces were the faces of lions. They were as swift as gazelles in the mountains. There's a list of some more of his commanders. List of some Benjamites. Verse 17, David went out to meet them and said to them, if you have come to me in peace to help me, I am ready to have you unite with me. But if you have come to betray me to my enemies when my hands are free from violence, may the God of our fathers see it and judge you. Then the Spirit came upon Amasai, chief of the 30, and he said, we are yours, O David. We are with you, O son of Jesse. Success to you and success to those who help you, for your God will help you. So David received them and made them leaders of his raiding bands. Some of the men of Manasseh defected to David when he went with the Philistines to fight against Saul. He and his men did not help the Philistines because, after consultation, their rulers sent him away. They said, it will cost us our heads if he deserts to his master Saul. Now wait a second. Remember, when he was on the run from Saul, he went and lived in the Philistine territory for a long time, and he and his men were mercenaries. Right? Well, just in case you remember that too, the writer of First Chronicles wants to point out, now while he was there, he did actually help the Philistines. Right? He didn't actually help the Philistines. He was just sort of there. He was living there, and he doesn't say why, right? Because Saul was trying to kill him. But he was he was living there, but he didn't really work with them. Right? So again, he's presenting himself back. Oh, I don't want people to think that. He's helping a bunch of Gentiles. Just to clarify. Right? Verse 20, when David went to Ziklag, these were the men of Manasseh who defected with them. They helped David against raiding bands, for all of them were brave warriors, and they were commanders in his army. Day after day, men came to help David until he had a great and mighty army. Now you notice these tribes, and there's going to be a big list here. These are numbers of the men armed for battle who came to David at Hebron to turn Saul's kingdom over to him, as the Lord said. So he lists all these men from all the tribes. Remember the way it was presented back in 2 Samuel. The 10 tribes of Israel, including some of the ones mentioned, the men of Issachar came to him, remember? So the tribes who came to him. They were never that keen on David, remember? And when David came back after Absalom, they basically said, well, we can ignore him now. Right? And went back to them. Even before the kingdom split, they were basically done with David. Well, so what's the author of Chronicles trying to say here? He's trying to say, well, when David became king, he had people in his army from all the tribes. Right? Now, am I saying he made this up? No. I'm saying he's pointing to a fact that 2 Samuel didn't. 2 Samuel didn't give us this list of how many fighting men David had in his army from which tribes. Right? Because man writing 2 Samuel, looking back from exile, right? Even back then, the tribes weren't unified. Right? He's looking back and pointing out. Chronicles, again, this is the golden age. This is when we were all one. This is when we were all together. Or as close as we ever got to it. Right? So he's going to point to all the facts, all the historical information he's got that shows that everybody was together. Okay? So it's not that one's lying and one's telling the truth. It's that they're emphasizing different things. 2 Samuel, the author's emphasizing all of the disunity, all of the signs of disunity. Okay? First Chronicles, he's emphasizing all of the signs of unity. Right? And like at any point in time, there's both. You could write a history of the United States before the Civil War and emphasize the unity of all the states. Or you could write a history of the United States before the Civil War and emphasize all of the disunity between the states. Both of which you could use just facts. Right? It's just two different emphases, right? Two different perspectives. Okay? So his point here that he's trying to emphasize is, at the beginning at least, right, when David was made king, he had soldiers from every tribe. We were all together then. So verse 38, all these were fighting men who volunteered. Right? He points out, they all wanted to be in David's army. He didn't draft them. They all signed up. They came to Hebron fully determined to make David king over all Israel. All the rest of the Israelites were also of one mind to make David king. The men spent 3 days there with David, eating and drinking, for their families had supplied provisions for them. Also their neighbors from as far away as Issachar, Zebulun, and Naphtali came bringing food on donkeys, camels, mules, and oxen. There were plentiful supplies of flour, fig cakes, raisin cakes, wine, oil, cattle, and sheep, for there was joy in Israel. I think this may be a good place to stop, because my voice is seizing up a little bit more. And we're through the rough patch in Chronicles. The rest of Chronicles is going to be more like the last couple chapters we did, more story and less like long repetitive genealogies. So I know this was a little more wearisome than a lot of the stuff we've read, but it's going to get better from here on out. We're getting back into story. Getting back into story here. But we're going to continue at kind of a quick pace, because again, this is history we've already talked about. So we're going to keep going kind of quick and comparing and contrasting and some of the things that are here, not other places. Once we're done with 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which I reckon will probably be by the middle of September, then we're going to be starting on 1st and 2nd Esdras, which is going to be all new. It's going to be the story of these guys who come back from exile in 516 and start trying to rebuild.
So it's like the board has come back
Yeah. Although, as I said, the rest of 1st and 2nd Chronicles is less boring than the part we did tonight. So, if you made it through this, you should be fine for the rest of the... Okay, so unless anybody has any questions, thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Father.
Who said we was in a hurry?